But Tony, let's hit some of the key findings from this quarter's report. And let's start with the data around ministry reach. What would you like to highlight from that section?
Yeah, so let's just jump right in with attendance. I think that's a question that still pastors are asking about frequently. And what the data shows from this current study is that average in-person attendance is still down 34% from the same period last year. So we had you have to remember this current report is looking at churches that completed this assessment sometime within the last 12 months. And some of those churches did this assessment either late in 2020 or early in 2021. And so they're still comparing for those churches some of their attendance patterns to pre-pandemic attendance patterns. Next quarter will actually be our first chance to see a full year's worth of data that will show attendance patterns during the pandemic itself. Now, what I will say too is anecdotally, we still are seeing rural churches are typically either back to full in-person attendance numbers or maybe even experiencing a little bit of growth. Churches that are in urban areas or suburban areas and also very large churches, they're still struggling to get back to pre-pandemic attendance numbers, and shouldn't be any surprise. In fact, I just was looking at some survey data that a company by the name of Qualtrics did just in the last weeks here, and it indicated that only 41% of people are comfortable going to religious services during the holiday season. And so if that's the case, especially for larger churches, no surprise that we still see attendance patterns where they are at this point. On the other hand, the number of online service views has more than tripled from the previous year, which stands to reason again, as churches are struggling to get people to come back to in-person attendance. The online engagement continues to increase. And if you're curious to know how many online service views should we expect compared to our in-person attendance, the average is roughly 4 times the number of online views as your in-person attendance. And so if you're wondering, is our online engagement strong or not? If you're more than 4 times your in-person attendance, your online engagement is very strong.
That's an interesting new kind of number to take a look at.
Yeah, I agree, Amy. I think it's good now to have that benchmark in place to know how are we doing with online engagement. Also related to ministry reach, the decline in children's ministry is, by the way, it's declined 38%, is steeper than the decline in student ministry, which has only gone down by 23%. And again, this is looking at both children and students that are coming together for in-person environments. Now the question is, what's driving that? My only suspicion here is maybe parents have more caution with their younger kids, and certainly that would be the case for parents that were waiting for vaccines for children. It could be that students are just tired of online engagement. I suspect that's the case, and they'd rather be hanging out with friends and in-person gatherings, and that may be the reason why the decline in student ministry isn't as significant as the decline that churches are experiencing with children's ministry. Another factor when we're looking at reach is just the number of new people that we're reaching as churches. And here, what the data has shown is that we're down about 20% when it comes to reaching new people. And the way we encourage churches to track this is to look at the number of new people that you're tracking in your database. And so what you can consider here is the average number of new people added was 10% of the overall number of people that churches are tracking in their database. Let me say it this way. If a church was tracking 1,000 people in their database, the average church added 100 new people over the past year. And so rather than trying to get people to come back to church, by the way, many of whom haven't been back to church in about 2 years, we need to start focusing on this benchmark instead. So how can we start reaching new people again? And
Mhm.
related to reaching new people, baptisms were down 49% year over year in this report. And granted, some churches were only meeting in line online in the last 12 months. And of course, that makes baptisms more
Yeah.
challenging. But anecdotally, I can tell you from my conversations with pastors that this decline in baptism isn't purely a result of a lack of access to water.
Mhm.
Churches are reaching fewer new people, and therefore it stands to reason that we're also seeing fewer people saying yes to Jesus and going public with their faith through baptism.
Let's shift to ministry connections. What trends are we seeing in that area, Tony?
Yeah, so a bit of good news here when it comes to connecting people into smaller groups, because what we're seeing is 65% of adults and students are somehow connected into a smaller group in all the churches that responded to this most recent survey. And by the way, that's a 2% increase overall in group engagement. And now looking at the data, we can tell you that almost 90% of churches offer some sort of small group option in their churches. And so rather than just think about ministry gatherings for men and women where they also then break out into smaller groups, or rather than thinking about Sunday school class options, 90% of churches now specifically offer small group options in homes. And so that's certainly a trend that we've noticed through the years. And honestly, it appears that it's even picked up
Mhm.
during the pandemic itself. On the other hand, we referred to this earlier. Volunteer engagement is still a struggle for churches. In fact, there's
Mhm.
now a further 3% decline in volunteer engagement. And overall, what we're seeing is only 40% of adults and students are serving at least once a month in the churches that responded. And Amy, that's the lowest level of volunteer engagement we've ever seen in
That's
this
right.
assessment. So because this is such a challenge for churches, let me just share this best practice we're hearing from the churches that we're serving right now. Rather than focusing on trying to get people to come back to serving roles, these churches have learned it's much better to focus on engaging new people in serving opportunities. So think about the new people that have come back to church, or the new people that are connecting with your church. Trying to invite those people into volunteer serving opportunities is where we're hearing churches are actually making some progress when it comes to increasing the number of people that are serving. And by the way, related to volunteer engagement, staffing compared to attendance continues to rise. In other words, we're seeing more staff in churches, even though attendance is either plateaued or it's declined. And you might ask, what comes first, the chicken or the egg here? In other words, because volunteer engagement is down, are we leaning more on paid staff? And so we're actually hiring more staff to do ministry, or because paid staff numbers are up, we're not leaning as much on volunteer engagement? I don't know which comes first there, Amy,
Mhm.
but there seems to be a correlation that as volunteer engagement numbers are coming down, staff numbers are increasing. And one way or the other, I think there's some correlation there. So we need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, can I just jump in with a couple thoughts on this one? Definitely with the staffs that I've worked with, they're wondering, are we right sized now?
That's
And
right.
so I think what you were saying is that we used to use this ratio, how many staff, like for every X number of people at our church, we hire a full-time person, right? And so
That's
we
right.
always said we should have a target of hiring one full-time person for every 100 attenders at the church. And of course, through the pandemic, well, who are our attenders now? Are they are online? Are they are in person? And so we aren't using that metric, but I'm seeing a lot of staffs that never reduced any staffing during the pandemic. And that's probably because finances were good. And I've just been encouraging them to be shifting more people towards their online ministry then, instead of just trying to do the in person, because most of the ministry, everyone wants to go back to in person. We're overstaffed in those areas now.
Yes.
But if they don't want to cut staff, refocus some of those numbers on reaching that online community, because that's really where people are taking their first steps. So it becomes a reach metric in my mind. One more thing on the volunteer piece of thing, Tony. What are you seeing with volunteer leadership?
Yeah, so related to that, and actually, we talked about volunteer leadership in last week's episode. And so, if you missed that, you might want to go back and listen to that specifically. But what the data is showing is that now churches have one leader for every 11 people in attendance. That's actually the strongest we've ever seen when it comes to volunteer leadership. And that is an improvement over what we saw in the data even 6 months ago. So I think we're seeing this is one area where churches seem to be winning now in this season of ministry.
But let's wrap up today's conversation talking about the financial trends. What are the key findings in that area, Tony?
Yeah, so what we're seeing here, unfortunately, when it comes to actual giving for the very first time in our reporting, we're seeing a decline in giving, and giving was down 1.5% year over year. Again, first decline we've ever noted through our assessments. In addition to that, giving units are down 8%. In fact, giving units are down more than the total giving number is. And so, what we're seeing in the churches is core givers are actually picking up a bigger chunk of the responsibility for funding ministry. And if I'm a pastor, a church leader listening to this, then I think the challenge might be how do we engage new givers, and how do we make sure new givers are taking steps when it comes to generosity as well. And so just trying to think about those strategies for encouraging people to take next steps with biblical stewardship. I think what this data is pointing to is there's opportunity there. At the same time, we should be celebrating those core givers in our church
Mm-hmm.
that appear to be, they've been much more generous in supporting ministry, especially in this last year. On the reverse side, I guess you could look at this as good news. Um, Churches have increased their cash reserves to 24 weeks of expenses. And by the way, that's up from 15 weeks pre-pandemic. But when I look at 24 weeks of cash reserves, my goodness, that's about 6 months of reserves. And Amy, that just feels too high.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for many churches now, we've been through the crisis. We kind of have a sense now of where we are, where we stand in our ministry, where we stand in our finances. And I really do believe it's time for churches to start investing in new ministry initiatives to accomplish our mission. And so rather than continuing to increase cash reserves, if they're at that level, now we need to be considering how do we invest in the mission that God's called us to as churches.